No, you're not seeing things, but this is as close as most of us ever get to a real RS200. And today on Kits and Cruising, I shall nobly force myself to drive this machine and tell you what it's like. I hope you appreciate the sacrifices I make for you. But first of all, a potted history of Ford's almost rally star.
The RS200 was Ford's belated entry into the Group B arena, earning its name from the 200 cars Ford needed to build to comply with the rules. By the time Ford's baby was getting close to competitive, however, Audi, Peugeot and Lancia had already been slugging it out for a couple of years, and a couple of fatal accidents spelled the end for Group B rally cars.
The story didn't end there though. The manufacturer was left with 200 cars or thereabouts after rallying had destroyed a few, and Ford's answer to that little problem was to stick in a bit of carpet and make a road-going supercar. Hurrah!
Installing carpets and luxury seats as a gesture towards comfort, the road cars were still pretty raw. Performance saw sub-6 second 0 to 60 times, and most were geared for 150 miles per hour, all with full-time four-wheel drive.
Even today, little touches them, and this excellent replica from RS Automotive will fool many people into thinking that you're one of the lucky very few owners. There are differences here though. It's longer, it's wider and it's lower as well, and that's all aimed at making more interior room available. And look at this. This door started life as a moulding taken from a 3-door Sierra modified to fit. And before you tut at such a blatant shortcut, let's remember, shall we, that that's exactly what Ford did with the original. Open that door, take a look inside, and we're confronted with the dashboard from a Sierra. Well, yes, but then so are real RS200 owners. You can start to see what I'm getting at, can't you? Of course, you're now going to turn around and say, but surely you can't fit the original running gear, can you? Well, no, that would be slightly costly. But if you're going to use the dashboard from a Sierra, you might as well use some of the other bits. So underneath me, we have the steering and suspension from the old Stager. Oh, and behind me, we have a Cosworth unit tuned to 360 brake horsepower mated to a Renault transaxle. So it should go some then. There's something quite comforting about sitting behind a familiar dashboard taken from an old Sierra, and at first you feel quite relaxed and calm and in control, and dawdling around at low revs, it's a very easy car to drive. But as soon as the turbo comes on at certain revs, things become a little bit trickier. And all of a sudden you become aware this is no shopping car. It's a very serious piece of kit, and a very well sorted piece of kit. It feels solid, the suspension feels just right, the ride is purposeful. This is a car you really could learn to drive quite hard. Now, we haven't been able to drive an original authentic RS200 next to this to make comparisons, but we on Kits and Cruising are prepared to stick our necks out and say that this is probably a lot more refined than the rally-bred original. That's not to say it isn't fast though, it is incredibly, but for normal everyday use it's probably a far more practical proposition. So that's a pretty wild thing then. But we're here in the land of Essex, and that is DAX territory. And over here we have the latest DAX Rush demonstrator, fitted with a Rover 4.8 litre V8, and we'll be driving this shortly, so stay tuned.
It's also fair to say that your three current products are, to all intents and purposes, genuinely VW based, or flat 4 horizontally opposed engine hung out the back of the car. So we've got the Speedster, we've got the RSK, And we've got what I think is arguably going to be a big seller for you, the Carman gear. However, having said that, when I first saw these Carman gears come into the country, I was very sort of, you know, I thought, yeah, I'd really like to buy one of those. But there was some ludicrous price that was being quoted, and you got, I think it was over £4,000, and you got so very little for your money. Now, you've bought that project now, haven't you?
Yes, we have, yes.
And you've done something fairly radical to the pricing.
Yeah, basically we've halved it. One of the problems when we undertook the project in the first place was it was, as you said, around the £4,000 mark. We felt that the kit was underdeveloped. It certainly wasn't up to the standard of the rest of the kits that we put the Legend name on it. And quite frankly, that's why it hasn't had the Legend name on it to date. It is a sport wagon. As of now, and this is absolutely current, it's going to become the Legend Sport Wagon, because we now feel comfortable that we can put our name to it. But that has taken 12 months of redevelopment to get it to that stage. And we were horrified by the price that we had got to come into the marketplace at to follow on from the previous owners of the project. Because how could we possibly put the price somewhere where we felt it should be without seeming that we were undercutting people and giving them short measure?
Yeah.
But what we've done is, because we build everything in-house, we do our own fiberglass, our own chassis work, our own fabrication, we do all of our own prototype work and development, so we are able to bring the costs down quite dramatically.
Now, a bit earlier on today we had a bit of a walk around the factory, and you pointed out to me something that you're doing with the RSK, and I was absolutely fascinated by your new front suspension, which you've got to admit the Beetle front suspension is totally outdated, and of course, as you were saying to me earlier, the problem is that as soon as you put a lighter weight body on, the suspension ratings, spring damping effect, go all to hell, and there's no real answer to it.
Exactly.
You've come up with an answer, haven't you?
We have. It's taken us a long time to come up with it, but we have done now, we feel, come up with an answer to this age-old problem. We have had in the last year probably 24, 3, 5, 6 kits in to do something with the front suspension. In fact, 2 of them were crash repairs, because the guys had put the brakes on a combination of disc brakes, lightweight, very, very stiff suspension springing. There was literally no grip on the front, and they'd had accidents. So we looked at this and said, now we really have got to sort this problem out, because it's getting to the point now where we'd already produced a soft ride spring kit which softened the front end by about 25%. But that really then only brought it back to the same sort of standard as it would be in a Beetle, which is still far too heavy for a car of this weight. So when we developed the 550 Spider particularly, and the RSK, we then said, okay, this car is now some 600 kilos all up weight with the driver aboard, and it's something like a 50-50 weight distribution. We have got to do something with the front suspension. Our soft ride system is no longer adequate. It doesn't have any means of adjustment. So we looked at the problem again, and we went right back to the roots of the problem, and we've now come up with a system of a coil-over shock absorber at the front, with our own special system of linking the trailing arms, and that works absolutely superbly.
It looks superb, and I wouldn't be wrong in saying that there doesn't seem to be so much alteration that it wouldn't retrofit anything else.
You're quite right. In fact, when we looked at the problem, we looked also at the problem of people with Beetles who'd come to us with similar problems. They wanted to lower the car by as much as 2 inches, 3 inches. And to do that, they had to spend £300 on a set of drop spindles. They had to spend £250 on a disc brake conversion kit, etc., etc., etc. Then you're probably looking at a bill of over £700. And then you were still looking at something which was not adjustable. So this system will in fact retrofit into any Beetle or any Beetle-based kit car that has a torsion beam front suspension.
What about the future?
What about the future? Yeah, I've got most of my toys around me now. I think the theory is that you get all the toys around you before you pop your clogs. There's not many more cars that I really want to do. I have to say that I've always wanted to do a Daytona Cobra Coupe. I've always wanted to do a knobbly Lister. And the knobbly Lister, I think, is a gorgeous car. But in my own sphere with the air-cooled cars, I think we've probably gone about as far as we're going to go.
Well, one of the most unusual cars here in this collection of hot rods and custom cars is what looks to me to be a reasonably standard Volvo. Glenn, is that right?
Yes, it is. Apart from the lowering job on it, it's been dropped 6 inches out the back, 5 out the front. Other little odds and sods that have been done is the door handle's been removed, the filler cap's inside the boot now. One-piece windows, electrically operated, solenoid operated doors, indicators put inside the front grille, basically.
Right, so I mean that's fairly standard then. What about the drivetrain and the transmission, etc.?
That's still all standard as it come out the factory.
And this is a Volvo
Amazon 122S.
What year?
1966.
Now these are quite collectible as a classic car.
That's correct, but I'm a rodder by heart.
So what are your aspirations? I'm going to bring Becky into this in a minute because the girls form a fundamental part of our work team, but what are you hoping to do to the car?
Well, eventually there's a new interior going in, and I'm uprating the engine in it at the moment. I'm looking out for a 3.5 litre Rover or a 302 small block Ford.
To give it a little bit more oomph?
Yes, but I don't want to go too big because I use it every day, well, for work mainly.
Okay, how did you two meet then?
Well, we met in the job club in '96, just before you bought this car, and he started 2 weeks earlier from me. And do you want to put a bit more into that story?
Well, basically, the job centre sent us down to a job club to get us back into work, and we knew each other for about a year. I got divorced, and after that we started dating for about a year. Then Beck decided, shall we get married? And within 3 weeks we was married.
Really? Now, let me ask the question then. All right, 3 weeks and you're married. Are you now a convert onto the custom car and rodding scene?
Yes, I do actually quite like them.
You do?
I do want a full pop, so I'm hoping to get a full pop soon.
What about, has Glenn does he let you drive this, for instance?
I can't drive.
I think you're going to have to take your test before you get a full pop. But I mean, would you like to be able to drive one of these things, and would you like to be able to work on one?
I'd like to drive his Corvette. I would love to drive his Corvette. The Amazon is a bit too big for me, as in like power-wise as well, and to get round corners.
So you've got a Corvette other than this, Glenn?
Yes, I have. Yes, I've had that 9 years now. It's just a standard 350. Been hotted up slightly. Take it up North Wheel drag racing, and from standard guys I've knocked 2 seconds off the standing quarter.
So you really are a rodding family through and through then?
Yes, we are. It started off when I was about 12, many moons ago, through my brother going up to Black Bush drag racing.
Now you are talking history. Glenn and Becky, good luck.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful, isn't it? Purposeful, menacing even. And the odd thing is, it all came about as a result of the Germans' love of sauerkraut and sausages in large quantities. Well, more or less. What actually happened was this. Rush were a company importing caterhams, and they discovered that in order to accommodate some of the more portly German posteriors, they'd have to widen the car. Caterham refused to give them permission, and so they designed their own modern take on a 7-style car, and this shape came about. Dax then stepped in and decided to start bringing the Rush in, but they felt the build quality wasn't up to scratch, so they re-engineered it underneath and on top, and this is the final result, the Dax Rush. And there's another important characteristic here, and this is a hint. Underneath here lies something a little bit special and not at all subtle. It's a 4.8 litre V8 Rover, over 300 and brake horsepower, in a car weighing not much, over 600 kilos. And this isn't untypical. This, in fact, is one of the milder engines that Dax fit to these. They've built a reputation for fitting some pretty wild units. Tales of incredible horsepower attained from these cars are not unheard of. And we could stand around all day and talk about it. Or we could drive it. I think we should drive it. Which in a car of this type is always going to mean a bit of a fight to climb in, although it's not too difficult in here. And straight away you can see that the standard of finish and fit inside is just as good here as it is outside. This is a factory built car, but Dax reckon that this standard is perfectly achievable for all of us. And I do like the sensible and practical layout in here. I like the way the dials move across into the passenger side rather than hide them behind the steering wheel. And let's face it, they're never going to be too far away to see. Having said that, it doesn't feel too cramped in here. I don't think my elbow will be in the ear of any passenger. So that's certainly a nice place to be, but obviously it is a purposeful place to be, and the purpose is moving along at some speed, so enough talk, let's fire it up. We're certainly not in gear. That would be a bad thing. We'll be straight over the trees if we are. Beautiful sound, obviously. Snick it into gear with its rather lovely silver gear knob. I do like that. Take the handbrake off, which unusually is located here, but that's quite a nice way of tidying it away, and that's about it really. We're off for some fun. There's no getting away from it. Any 7 influence in this car is so deeply buried, it's barely there. Whereas the old car was about a bit of sort of what out chaps and a quick jaunt through the countryside and your slightly underpowered British sports car, this is not underpowered. It was designed from the very outset to accommodate huge amounts of brake horsepower, and this at about 330, 350 brake is actually one of the most, well, underpowered versions, if you can imagine it. These things have been powered up to over 700. It's incredibly stiff, the ride is absolutely rigid, the steering as direct as you can imagine, and the noise, well, try this. Because it's a big V8, it relies on sheer brawn rather than messing about with turbos and such. That means that there is colossal torque available from absolutely no revs. More or less, any speed you like, any revs. Gears, they're all irrelevant. Just floor your right foot and off you go. There's no doubt that all the work Dax have put into sorting the rush has resulted in a car that is absolutely resolved and complete. It is well able to handle colossal amounts of power and overall really does feel finished, complete. This is how it should be, which is probably more than can be said for our project car. And it's time now to find out how work's going.
Since you were last here, the Jester finally starts to look like a real car. We have a body shell sitting on the chassis, so it actually starts to look like more than a bag of bolts. It isn't finally fitted on though. We have to take the body shell off a few times to set things up. We've still got to fit the rear luggage tray, so we've got to set all that up. We've still got to do some work. We've got to fit the exhaust and things like that. But the job that's causing us the most grief at the moment is fitting the heater, which I'll come back to in a minute. Now, in order to get the shell to this stage, what we've had to do is nibble away around the suspension towers here and also around the steering column, just so it'll sit down nice and square on the chassis. But eventually, what we're going to have to do when we fit it to finally and bond it in, we're going to have to open these out even more because it needs to sit a little bit lower. So we need to cut a little bit away from the back here and open these out so they'll sit down below these rubbers. And also at the front and around the wheel arches and at the back, we have to bond in some fiberglass panels which will actually make a strong bond between the body and the chassis, so it's going to be a very strong unit at the end of the day. Right now we're working on the heater. We have hidden under here a heater box which I've got currently mounted on blocks of foam to get it to the desired height. I have drilled or ground a slot in the bulkhead which caused a nice few sparks and it looked quite spectacular at the time. But that's so we can get the tubes from the heater box through to the radiator and the engine, so that we can have a through flow of hot water. Now, the reason why the heater is so important, apart from keeping my tootsies warm in the winter, is that we have to have demisting for the windscreen, and this is where we've hit a few snags. Now, traditionally with kit cars, what people have done is taken whatever's on the donor car, i.e. big plastic tubes which are quite big and bulky, and they've mounted them under the dashboard somehow and fitted the plastic clips that were fitted to the dashboard on the donor. Well, I've tried to be a little smarter, probably a little too smart for my own good, and I've come up with these aluminium boxes. Now, they're made up of dead bits of caravan. This is actually aluminium taken from a dead caravan, which is very thin and very pliable and very easily bent. And what I've made is these little tubes, 5 inches by 2 deep, and the first one is already sat underneath here on top of the heater box, and that runs all the way along the top here, so that when I fit the windscreen and actually set that up, all I have to do is cut my little slots, having bonded in my little tube, and I should have a nice clean through flow of air, a nice blast of hot air hitting the windscreen, which is the desired thing. The worst thing you can have is anything blocking the way, so hopefully that's going to work. So we're going to have that taped in place, and then eventually take the body shell off and bond that in place. Now at the front we were going to cut a hole into the bulkhead here, so that we can get a clean through flow of air into the heater box, because there's a fan about there and an intake. But it occurred to me that with the bonnet in place, that's going to restrict airflow to start with, and also with the windscreen you're just going to have water running in and straight into the heater, which isn't really desirable, especially with the electric motor sitting on top. So I've resorted to another of my little aluminium tubes. This is going to be bonded in underneath the body shell, right up there, and it's going to be a little further over. We have a hole for the intake and the little electric fan, and at the side here the chassis gets panelled off. So what I'm going to do is, when I panel up the chassis, leave a little hole, this slides along, gets bonded into the body shell, and we have an intake that comes from underneath the wheel arch. Now the idea of this is that A, you don't get any water running in, you get a nice big tube of air for the heater to suck into, and hopefully that's all going to work. I'll keep you posted.